Hi, friends. This is Doug Reeves, and I want to tell you how much I appreciate you joining us for today. Good afternoon to my friends in the East. Bonsoir to my friends in Europe who are joining us. So great to have an international conversation today. And to my friends in Asia, go to bed. It's midnight there. You can watch this recording later on. And by the way, for everybody, we always make these recordings available for free, as well as all the handouts that you see. It is now my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Kate Anderson Foley. Dr. Anderson Foley is a national leader on the issues of social and emotional learning, as well as a leader on the issues of multi-tiered systems of support and equity. She's had a career of leadership at the local, state, and national levels, and we're very lucky to have her here today. Dr. Anderson Foley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
So before we begin, give us an overview of a lot of people toss around the term social and emotional learning, or SEL. Please tell us how we should focus on that and what it means from your perspective.
So I would say first and foremost that we need to see social emotional learning as not an add-on program. It's a way of looking, and it's a way of believing that students who walk in the door as they are and who they are, with their families and backgrounds and circumstances, we as adults and we as the organization need to be responsive to them and see them through a strength-based lens rather than a deficit-based lens.
So walk us through what can we learn from today's presentation?
I think the main point is this, that when we start to take a look at the whole child, and I'll preface it by saying, you know, when the Every Student Succeeds Act was reauthorized, it's great intentions that we have the shift to the whole child. But what happened next was everybody started to mandate social and emotional learning, be it curriculum, you know, programming, etc. And they started to parse it out. And they started to create two separate strands, the academic and the social emotional, when in fact, it's the social emotional lens and the belief systems, and that you have that as the foundation, then the academics can come in. Then you can start to look at the whole child through health and well-being, discipline that's equitable, and the learning and the designing of learning that's equitable. So today, really looking at, you know, what are those adult competencies? What can school districts start to do to shift the mindset from it being an add-on program to it being the thing that is going to, when you get it right, then it's the thing that's the catalyst toward student outcomes.
I would just add, Kate, that one of the things we've learned in our research in more than 2,000 schools is that it's practices, not programs. In other words, SEL is not something you buy or something you put in the wall. It really is the culture and the practices of each school.
100%, and thank you for saying that, because I've always been a fan of the practices that are going to be driving the improvement process. And for me and my experience, and yours as well, Doug, context matters. You can't apply something holistically in one district that it just doesn't match. And that's the personalization that comes from this.
So what's next?
So I think you'll see on the slide the whole child that really does take a look at, again, you understand that the student comes with their family and community into the schoolhouse. And I think sometimes we as adults tend to forget that. But we really need to take a look at that. But the adult competency would be then taking that perspective of the student, understanding the barriers that can mask potential, such as it could be economic insecurity, it could be trauma, it could be linguistic barriers. There's a host of barriers that mask potential. It could be disability, homelessness. It could be a variety of things. And the adult needs to be self-aware, but then start to design the instruction, design the environment that's safe and supportive. And then for sure, one of my all-time is you must have high expectations for student success, regardless of their background, their circumstance. It's not looking at what the child can't do, but it's looking at how do I, the adult, need to make access available so the child can learn and be feeling safe and secure about that.
And there are
So,
really some standing
go ahead.
examples that I should just call out on both sides of the country. In the East, Newark Public Schools received national recognition for their service to homeless students. And they pay attention to things. Not, reading and math scores are important, but so is having clean clothes. So is having a safe place to sleep.
Right.
And they just do an amazing job to, as you suggested, take care of the whole child, even though sometimes accountability systems measures 10%, and the other 90% is what my friends in Newark pay attention to. On the other side of the country, another district with very high levels of poverty, San Bernardino, has done exceptionally great work. And literally, I just learned this morning, increasing the graduation rate from the 60s to the high 90s, even as economic conditions deteriorate. And that's not just because they're getting better reading scores. That's because they're taking care of the emotional and physical safety of these children.
That's correct. And that's where I think states and districts can really focus their effort on policy that pay attention to those things. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I often get this question, and I'm sure you do too, Doug. Well, so what is social emotional learning? And we talked a little bit about this, that it's that lens in which beliefs, expectations, or practices are viewed. It is so important that it's about the adult right here. This is where the adult really sits within the school community. What are their beliefs about children and their learning? Do they have high expectations, relentless high expectations? And then how does that translate into the practices? That students reside at the very center of everything that we do. This is not about the adult, it's about the student, and creating those safety nets and the bridges and those responsive practices that are going to allow the student to build the muscle that he and she needs in order to be successful, but really be resilient. Because remember, school is only for 6 hours a day. They go about their lives, and that's where a lot of this transference needs to take place as well.
Yep.
And then and finally, creating and providing that framework that intentionally, and I underscore this, intentionally builds the attitudes and the competencies of the adult, of that self-awareness, those meaningful relationships, and then how do you help the student become more resilient in and outside of school?
Now, part of the thesis of this whole webinar is SEL takes place through an equity lens. And one of the things you mentioned, I think, has a special resonance to central office leaders and perhaps even to policymakers and board members who are listening, and that is the tendency to silo three areas. We've got instructions over here, so there we're talking about high expectations. Then we've got social and emotional over here, and then we've got equity over here, as if they're all three separate domains. When what I hear you saying, Kate, is you got to integrate those three, or we wind up having kids lost in the cracks in between.
That's right. It's a different way of looking at things, and thank you for saying that. We in education do a great job at siloing. What my practice has been about is breaking down the silos and creating one fabric that is nimble, responsive, and has stretch. And that way, most students, if not all students, can find themselves in their school and see themselves as valued, and then be able to learn. It's all about, you got to tap into the learning. And I know schools are tasked with the accountability, but if they don't see that this is the equity that we're talking about, and that this is the foundation for the accountability process. But you are right, and my experiences has been that it cannot be seen as separate. It has to be seen as one and the same.
Thank you.
So this is just a little graphic of what we just finished talking about, and I kind of wanted to walk through some of those things when we say how do we teach the whole child? How do we support the whole child? In my work around the country and working with different state ESSA plans, all talk about the whole child, but then some states, for sure are doing it better than others, and it's new territory for a lot, but you can't start to strand these out. They have to be braided together, and that's policy, practice, operational types of things. So again, when we look at social emotional learning, it's not an add-on program. It is the set of beliefs. It is the set of practices that, when integrated deeply throughout that district, be it policy, handbooks, how we're looking at educating families, the community at large, the conversations that we have with the mayor's office or city council, other community organizations. This is how it comes to life. Acknowledging the student's culture and the background as an asset. I spent a lot of time on this because we come to education as teachers or as leaders because we want to, this is an interest of ours. But what I've discovered is, for the last, I'd say 15, 20 years, is that students are different, not in any particular way, but as evolution has happened, as our world has changed, and as it's become faster, and the internet and everything is spinning at a very fast rate, students are in that vortex. And yet oftentimes the adult is still standing in front of the student as if they were trained back when they were in college. And that is a mismatch. And we need to do a better job of looking at the students, recognizing them, understanding, celebrating who they are, and seeing them as assets. One of the biggest pieces of work that I've done around this, as well as the accountability and breaking down the barriers, is coming and looking as an adult in the mirror and identifying we all have biases. We all do. And that's just the human condition. But what's different is this. We must look in the mirror and identify who we are and what our biases are, but then we need to learn the strategies to override them so the benefit of the student and the learning environment. And so by that I mean maybe we have a preconceived notion of students from one demographic or a disability category. Well, let's think about that. Let's look at how students really are achieving and look at all the different ways that, let's say, technology can be used to mitigate those, and then the student can demonstrate mastery. Well, isn't that great? Now we've overridden that limiting bias, and we've pulled in strategies that can bridge where the student is to what their real potential is. And that's part of that learning environment as well. Perspective taking skills, that is something that, again, it goes back to looking in the mirror. But when adults start to look at, let's put yourself in someone else's shoes, you then become, that's the adult competency of increasing your own self-awareness. And when you are aware of how you are looking at students, you have the opportunity to change that behavior, thus change the strategy so the student can access safe and supportive, for sure, but then the actual content itself. An example would be, building that culturally responsive muscle. We know that students need to see themselves in the learning. And if you have a student or groups of students that the material, the books, the way, something that maybe the topic is presented in a very, Eurocentric way, well, then they don't see themselves and they wouldn't be very engaged. Now, when that happens, discipline issues arise. You don't have an engagement, you don't have any buy-in. And so we need to really build that responsive muscle. I think we all need to have skin in the game. The other part of it has to do with infusing that SEL know-how into the lesson design itself. that instruction. And importantly, the assessment. I think sometimes we forget about the assessment. We're all about front loading into, maybe some culturally responsive ways, or, socially, emotionally responsive ways, but we forgot about the assessment. And that is something that when you have those in place, you put those into practice, students can then demonstrate what they know, both academically and behaviorally, if you will. And that is the true measure of student outcomes. And then finally, and we talked a little bit about this, is that integration into the policies and practices. Oftentimes, board members themselves, how wonderful they are to want to be a part of the school community, but they are still individuals. And sometimes coming to understanding what social emotional learning is, it's not a written policy per se, but how are we using, how are we infusing strong, positive SEL into our board policies, into our discipline, our student handbooks, the tiered system of support. And when we look at SEL, I view it as having enough stretch to cover everybody. And that way the tiered system of support isn't looking artificially at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Those things are important, but what we're talking about here is the iteration, the morphing of the universal SEL, as well as the academic supports.
Kate, I want to go back to what you said about cultural relevance, because it's very much a topic of conversation these days, and I've seen it go well and go badly. Just today, for example, I saw a great article on today's Marshall Memo. I hope all of our viewers are subscribing to that, and if you're not, I'll send you this article from today that had how do we augment the canon. That is the canon of literature that a lot of kids read,
Right.
with things that will resonate more with immigrant kids, with African-American kids, with Latino kids, and so on. And it was really a thoughtful way to say it's not either or, it's both and.
Exactly.
And so that to me was a thoughtful way of addressing this issue of cultural relevance that you raised. The bad response, I fear, is a greedy publisher putting a brown and black face on top of a really terrible textbook and saying, oh, now we're culturally relevant. And
Right.
and I hope all of our viewers know we have no allegiances at all with any vendor, with any publisher. All we're trying to do is to take relevance seriously. And you can't separate the equity issue from the issue of social and emotional learning. They all go together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know when I've done, I go in and do various equity audits, and one of the things that I really focus in on is the instructional material. And for those that still have libraries, what's in the library? And when you're doing lesson design, how are you pulling in culturally and linguistically responsive materials? Again, I can't emphasize this enough. If we want children to feel welcome, safe, and supportive, they need to see themselves in their school, in their learning. I agree with you, Doug. You can't just put a poster up of a black or brown child and say that it's good. It's not. Again, it goes back to what are those beliefs, but at the district level, but then at the school level and the classroom level. And, a whole nother strand of this could certainly be on the teacher evaluation side, and not from a punitive side, but how can adults, the administrator, really help build those skill sets of the adult? Self-awareness is the first step in order to change. And so we think about those perspectives, and we touched a little bit about that. I cannot stress enough, we need to look at students as assets. What they bring to school is an asset, be it homelessness, be it economic insecurity, or they are one of the main breadwinners in their families, or in a rural community, maybe they're dealing with a drug crisis that maybe another suburb doesn't deal with. So there's a variety of things. And I think every school year, administrators and school folks should be looking at who their community is. There's a lot of trend data, but we know we just need to be in our community in order to understand how it's changing, where it's changing, what do we need to do to be responsive to who our students are for this coming year. That's not to say everything gets thrown out in the library and new books are ordered. No, but let's look at how do we supplement where we might be short. And so I think too, and as I mentioned, it's not a one size fits all and the context matters, but I want to really focus in on this because this has been part of my practice for many years. Empathy with action. My background is in special education, but always through the lens of general education. And so I looked at students on IEPs as very capable, but they just might need to get that information in a different way. But well-meaning folks often would feel sorry for the student and would say, Kate, I just feel so sorry for them, thus lowering the expectations for what kids can do. And I've said, don't feel sorry, help. And by that, I mean, get that empathy. You do need empathy because sometimes kids, that's a hard thing for a kid to be with. But you need to be able to offer that bridge of high expectations. And that, yes, I understand where you are coming from and those hurdles. I am going to help you bridge so you can access the learning, show me you've got it. And that is the outcome that we all want. And so empathy with action, if people take nothing away from today, that's the key that I want. And then finally, understanding how physical health, nutrition, trauma can really impact access to learning. This is not the feel good. This is the science of how these things impact learning. We know that if you're hungry, you can't attend. We know that trauma comes in very subtle ways or very, explicit ways. But being aware of who our students are, getting to know them, making sure they're valued, really is impactful. And and when I was at the state level, when we were building out the SS state plan, because of my experiences, I understood that health and wellness were one of the backbones to a strong accountability system. And the SEL is that backbone in order to get to the outcomes at hand that we're all responsible for.
I want to return to what you said about empathy into action. Our mutual colleague, Dr. Stacy Scott, who's the author of Making Equity Work, has written so eloquently on this, and he despairs, if I can at least paraphrase him, that feeling bad about inequities isn't enough. It's all about action. It's all about now what do we do? And
Absolutely.
One of the things that Dr. Scott does, I think, brilliantly is to say, for example, you use the example of libraries. It's not enough to say, oh, gee, there's inequities. Well, no kidding. And anything, there's lots of inequities there. But purging the library is not necessarily the answer. I've seen great middle school exercises, for example, of turning kids loose into 20th century encyclopedias and say, you find the examples of bias, find the examples of implicit racism, and do a before and after how you would correct it. That's critical thinking, that's high expectations, that's great cognitive development. So even though some of these resources you might be tempted to throw into the bonfire, don't, because our kids can learn so much from identifying what the flaws of the past have been and being advocates for themselves and identifying bad stuff when they see it, and most importantly, having a constructive response to it.
Absolutely, and you just identified that advocacy that we want to teach our students.
Yeah.
And
by the way, I mentioned Newark earlier. I just have to tell you, one of the best staff developments I've ever done was not me saying anything, but having Newark students stand up and talk about immigration policy, talk about racism, talk about inequities, and the students' voices can be remarkably perceptive and eloquent if we make them part of this conversation.
100%, and that is, I strongly advocate for that. I can tell you, when politics aside, but when immigration was was really happening and kids were being removed and parents were being removed, it had a traumatic effect on the city and the neighborhoods that I lived in and the schools in which I was responsible for. And yet the adults were trying to tamp it down, and I kept saying, we need to hear from the students. Children need to have their voice in order to help untangle what's going on in their lives.
Yeah.
That's building resiliency. That's building the muscle that we're looking for. And so, looking at the adult competency of reducing those barriers, kind of what we just talked about, the health and wellness for sure. Supportive environments, again, kids are very astute and they know if they are respected, if a teacher has an interest in them. And so this is part of strong and equitable social emotional learning, that the adults in the organization, in the schools, in the classroom, on the playground, in the lunchroom, they respect the students for who they are, and there's authentic relationships. That goes a long, long way. We touched on the trauma and adverse experiences, and I've done some work with this, and it is, adverse childhood experiences, and that report has been around for a number of years, and it's been parsed in a lot of different ways. And so when you know better, you do better. And we know more and more about the science of brain development and adverse childhood experiences. We need, as educators, to put our professional hats on, take those, understand them, unpack them, and then start to build not only the lessons, but our school culture, our school discipline policies, and really start to capitalize on being aware and then flipping it to make it a more strength-based approach. Of course, that goes with cultural competence as well. You mentioned this, Doug, your examples with Newark. The same thing applies. That is the cultural competence of adults. We still don't have as many male and teachers of color as we want who are going to match and mirror who our students are. Now, there's two different camps. There's some that say that doesn't matter as long as there's a strong educator in front of you. The other is it really does matter because kids need to see themselves. I think it's a blend of both. If we already have shortages as is, if we already have many mandates being placed upon schools and districts, we have to, like you said, you can't throw out all the books in the library. Well, we can't do that with teachers either. So we should be celebrating who our great educators are, but then equipping them so they can be culturally competent. And it's not just about color or immigration status. A lot of it has to do with poverty. A lot of it has to do with situations that students and families are in. That's competence as well. And then finally, that system of support, from my very early days as an administrator all the way up to, the state level, more counselors, more social workers. It's a very emotionally charged issue. But I have always said, and I stand by this, that more social workers and counselors isn't the answer. It's part of, but everybody has to be socially and emotionally competent. And we can't look at it from a clinical deficit base, but we need to look at it as part of our school community, and that everybody needs to have skin in the game.
Thank you.
And so those things then go into the high expectations. There has to be a relentless belief that students are capable, regardless of where they come from, how they're walking in the door. They are capable learners. What do we, the adults, need to do to get the conditions right? And that professional development really does need to be supported through coaching. It cannot be, it's August or it's September, we're going to give you a 3-day training and off you go. It doesn't work that way. I mentioned briefly about the tiered system of support. I've spent many years dismantling or desiloing departments within school districts. and building a support that works for everybody, that is based on the strength, and that looks at how are we looking at all kids. And then from there, like you put a pebble in the water and it ripples out. Well, we have to start with the center of that, and that is what are we doing for all kids? How are we supporting all children? And when you start to build a system, a strength-based system that way, it allows for that flexibility, or that stretch, if you will, to say, okay, still core, still whatever, but it's stretching for the kids who we have in front of us. And then finally, those district policies that I talked about earlier, the evaluation instruments, not punitive, but how are we supporting? It is an ongoing, like equity, social emotional learning, there is no stop to this. It's a never-ending journey. It's how deeply we learn and become more competent in our skills. And we can't forget about our parents, but we also can't forget about our community partnerships. They too need to have high expectations for not only the school district, but for who's in the school district. And we know that we talked about the job or the coaching, I should say. That is so critical. Everyone's saying, well, we've done all this professional development on social and emotional learning. Why? Because it's been mandated, right? And then some places it's because it's the right thing, and some of it's a mixture of both. However, staff feel that they are not prepared, and that is where we need to listen to the teachers and the support staff, counselors, nurses, what have you. We need to listen, and we need to give ourselves permission, and districts need to give themselves permission to say, we're not going to go 110 miles an hour to get to SEL where we think there's a destination. We're going to take our time and do this right and build the competencies of the adult, because it's the adult who has to turn around and instruct the student. I'll give one example. In Illinois, where social emotional learning standards were first in the nation, what happened was it was put down, it was mandated into the school districts. The district leaders said, okay, well, I've got to do something with it. And they quickly turned it and said, okay, this is about kids. Well, hold on. It is about children, but nobody took the time to say, what are the adult competencies needed in order to make this happen? The looking in the mirror. How do you design lessons? How do you start to look at policies and practices? That was the missing piece. Well, we know that without those pieces, it's doomed to fail. And then what will happen? It's about the kids. And that's a vicious cycle that sometimes we find ourselves in. So
we've had a couple of questions come in from our viewers. So Kate, let me just start tossing those to you if you want. Sure. What is the first step toward trying to embed social and emotional learning into our schools?
The first step would be to understand what it is that that school is trying to accomplish. Social emotional learning is about those beliefs and values and practices. Where are they now? I'll use the word audit, not in a negative way, but in a very positive way. Let's take a look at where the school is right now. And then where are the teachers and the staff within that process? And then start to design professional development toward the adult on, so what is social emotional learning? What are culturally responsive practices? And then what are, let's say, positive discipline, restorative justice types of things. Those are some of the bigger components about that.
Well, and you're quite right that audit can be a very scary word. So right. Would you describe for our viewers, what are some of the things, when you're inquiring about where are we with equity, where are we with SEL, what sort of observations and questions are you asking?
So when I look and I work with schools and districts, I look to see who the teachers are. I mean, obviously I need to know what the district is and what the makeup of the district is. But when I start to look inside, who are the teachers? You know, how long have they been around? What's their have they moved within the district? You know, who are they? And then I start to look at the students. From there, I start to dig into, okay, so who are those students and what opportunities do they have? For example, girls, how many girls or what percent of girls are in advanced courses, especially the STEM? How many girls of color? How many students on IEPs are achieving not just the IEP goals, but actually achieving grade level content? How many students on IEPs are in advanced courses? We know that the majority of students with IEPs have a learning disability, which by definition you have average to above average intelligence. Thus, where are those students, and equitably then, where aren't they?
You're
And
making me
then
smile because in this week's news, of course, we have this young Swedish woman who, at the age of 15, on the autism spectrum, is internationally visible, leading climate change discussions. Not to mention engaging in transatlantic travel solo. I mean,
exactly,
clearly brilliant. And
exactly.
and so I just think we need to redefine not only what high expectations mean, and she's an exemplar of that, but also what disability means, which means
Right,
autism is rotten. I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but I'll tell
right.
you what, it's certainly not a limitation when when you look at what not only this young woman from Sweden, but other people have done. So we're going to run out of time here in just a couple of minutes, but I want to get to a couple of more questions. What is the answer for uh, administrators who confront teachers who are not willing to engage in SEL?
So that's an interesting question. I would say, what is it that I'm going to take a school principal? If the school principal, and that is the climate and culture of that building, and there are non-negotiables within that spectrum of strong social emotional learning, and I, as the principal, have provided PD and professional coaching to all my teachers, and maybe that particular teacher in particular, because he or she might be struggling, and I've given everything that I can. There's going to come a point where it is a hard and courageous conversation to say, if you are not able to do this or willing to do this, then we'll need to move down a different path. I think sometimes people are afraid to say that. And, you know, we need to say that out loud, because this is about a child's life. And a teacher and the beliefs that a teacher has can change the trajectory of a child's life. I've seen it. I've witnessed that.
And I think the role of the administrator who apparently asked this question is immense frustration that there are people who basically throw up their hands and say, I'm doing the
Right.
best I can, there's nothing else I can do. And you know, our colleague Kim Marshall says, every time we tolerate mediocrity, every time we tolerate inequity, we're saying that it's okay. And ultimately, we have to make a decision that it's really not okay.
That's
Well,
correct.
we're at the end of our time, Kate. It has flown by. Any concluding thoughts for our viewers?
I would say that you are in the unique position to make substantive change in a child's life. Take the time, dig deep. Don't be afraid to face your biases. We have them. Let's figure out how to override them, design the learning and the learning environment so kids can see themselves and be successful.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kate Anderson Foley. We are really pleased to have you today, and thanks for addressing this great audience. And thanks for people from around the world who are willing to join us. I want to invite all of you to come to Boston, as Billy Joel said, in June of 2020. We meet in the Back Bay. It's a small group, but you'll hear from some amazing speakers, not only Kate, but also Pooja Arjawal, the author of Powerful Teaching.
Mm-hmm.
You'll hear from Jennifer Gonzalez, the creator of Cult of Pedagogy. You'll hear from AJ Pethe, who has been the architect of great turnaround schools, and immodestly me. I've got some pretty good new research as well that I'm happy to share. So we're really happy to have all of you there. We'll have an international group of presenters, but most of all, you. So I hope you'll come to Boston and consider spending some time joining us there. Eat some seafood, cheer for the Red Sox, and so, Kate, thank you so much, and thanks to
You're
our
welcome.
audience. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.